The morning mist clung to the Virginia woods like the breath of ghosts. But beneath its ethereal veil, 50,000 men prepared to die on the dawn of June 3, 1864. Lieutenant General Ulysses Simpson Grant stood at the edge of history, his weathered hands gripping field glasses that would soon witness one of the most devastating massacres in American military history. Grant's reputation had been forged in the crucible of Western victories: Shiloh, Vicksburg, Chattanooga, but here in the tangled wilderness of Virginia, he faced his most formidable opponent. General Robert Edward Lee, the Gray Fox of the Confederacy, had turned the crossroads settlement of Cold Harbor into a fortress of death, his entrenchments stretching like a malevolent scar. Across the landscape, the Union Army of the Potomac had been bleeding for weeks since crossing the Rapidan River in early May. Grant had hurled his forces against Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in a relentless campaign that had already consumed 36,000 casualties. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, the North, and a river, each battlefield had been a charnel house. Yet Grant pressed on with the grim determination that had earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender. Cold Harbor represented more than a tactical objective. It was the gateway to Richmond, the Confederate capital that lay tantalizingly close, less than 10 miles away. Control of this crossroads would allow Grant to threaten Lee's supply lines and potentially end the war that had already torn the nation apart for 3 bloody years. But Lee understood the stakes as well. The Confederate commander, his gray beard now white with the strain of command, had positioned his army behind a network of earthworks that would have impressed Caesar himself. His soldiers, veterans of countless battles, had learned the deadly art of field fortification. Using bayonets, tin cups, and bare hands, they had carved rifle pits and trenches that turned the gentle Virginia countryside into a killing field. As referenced in the comprehensive account by the American Battlefield Trust, the Confederate defensive positions represented the evolution of warfare itself, a preview of the industrial slaughter that would define the next century of conflict. The morning of June 3 dawned hot and humid, the kind of Virginia summer day that made wool uniforms a torment and turned metal so hot it burned the skin. Grant's battle plan was deceptively simple: a coordinated assault along multiple points of the Confederate line, designed to overwhelm Lee's defenders through sheer force of numbers. 3 corps would advance simultaneously: the 2nd Corps under Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, the 6th Corps under Major General Horatio Wright, and the 18th Corps under Major General William Farrar Smith. At precisely 4:30 in the morning, the signal guns roared their deadly symphony across a front stretching nearly 7 miles. The blue-clad soldiers of the Union Army rose from their earthworks and advanced into the growing light. Their battle cry, "Huzzah!" echoed across the field, a sound that would soon be replaced by screams of agony. The Confederate response was immediate and devastating. From their concealed positions, Lee's men unleashed a storm of musket fire that swept the advancing Union ranks like a scythe through wheat. The carefully orchestrated assault dissolved into chaos within minutes, as entire regiments were cut down before they could close with the enemy. General Hancock's 2nd Corps, the pride of the Army of the Potomac, found themselves caught in a crossfire that turned their advance into a massacre. Men fell in waves, their bodies carpeting the ground between the opposing lines. The 6th Corps fared no better, their assault dissolving under the withering fire of Jubal Anderson Early's Confederates. By sunrise, the cream of Grant's army lay shattered on the field. In less than an hour, some accounts suggested as little as 10 minutes, nearly 7,000 Union soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. The assault had been so swift and devastating that many Confederate defenders later claimed they had barely needed to aim. The Union ranks were so tightly packed that random shots found their mark. As the morning wore on and the full scope of the disaster became clear, even Grant, a man who had grown accustomed to the arithmetic of death, was shaken by what he had witnessed. The butcher's bill for Cold Harbor would haunt him for the rest of his days, a reminder that even in war, some victories came at too high a price. The acrid smoke of gunpowder hung over Cold Harbor like a funeral shroud, and within its gray embrace lay the broken dreams of the Union Army. Colonel Theodore Lyman, a staff officer with the Army of the Potomac, would later write that the battlefield resembled a giant's grave, where the dead lay in windrows. The assault of June 3rd had lasted barely 30 minutes, but its consequences would reverberate through the remainder of the war. General Grant, his usual stoic demeanor cracked by the magnitude of the disaster, stood among the wounded and dying men of his command. Round him, the sounds of battle had been replaced by something far more haunting: the cries of thousands of wounded soldiers lying between the lines. Beyond the reach of stretcher bearers, the space between the Union and Confederate positions, no more than 50 yards in some places, had become a no-man's land where the injured lay suffering under the merciless Virginia sun. The Confederate defenders, many of them veterans of 2 years of bitter fighting, watched with a mixture of awe and horror at the carnage they had inflicted. Private John Cassler of the Stonewall Brigade later recalled that the Union dead were piled up like cordwood in front of their positions. The efficiency of their defensive fire had been so devastating that many Confederates had barely expended their ammunition supplies. Lee's tactical genius had been on full display. Rather than manning a single line of defense, he had constructed multiple layers of earthworks, each designed to channel attacking forces into carefully prepared killing zones. His artillery, positioned to provide enfilading fire, had been integrated into the defensive scheme with deadly precision. The Confederate commander had learned the lessons of previous battles, particularly Gettysburg, where his own forces had been slaughtered in frontal assaults against prepared positions. But the true horror of Cold Harbor lay not in the initial assault, but in what followed. The wounded men lying between the lines were beyond help, and neither side dared venture into the open ground to retrieve them. The informal truces that had sometimes developed in earlier battles were nowhere to be found. The survivors, both Union and Confederate, could only listen as their comrades called out for water, for their mothers, for death to end their suffering. Grant, confronted with the reality of what his tactics had wrought, faced a decision that would define his character for history. Pride demanded that he continue the assault, that he commit more men to the killing ground in hopes of achieving a breakthrough. Military logic suggested that the Confederate lines were impregnable, that further attacks would only add to the already staggering casualty lists. The Union commander chose a middle path that satisfied neither military necessity nor humanitarian concern. Rather than ordering a general retreat or launching another massive assault, he settled in for what would become a siege. The Army of the Potomac began digging their own elaborate system of trenches, paralleling the Confederate works at distances that sometimes narrowed to mere yards. Major General Ambrose Everett Burnside's 9th Corps, which had been held in reserve during the morning assault, was ordered to probe the Confederate right flank. These attacks, launched throughout the afternoon of June 3rd, met with no greater success than the morning's disaster. The pattern was becoming clear. Any force that ventured into the open ground between the lines would be cut down by Confederate fire. The psychological impact of Cold Harbor extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. News of the disaster spread quickly through the Union camps, carried by the walking wounded and the stretcher bearers who had witnessed the carnage firsthand. Morale, already strained by weeks of heavy fighting, plummeted to new lows. Letters home took on an increasingly pessimistic tone, with soldiers writing what many assumed would be their final communications to loved ones. In the Confederate camps, the victory brought little celebration. Lee's army, while tactically triumphant, was slowly being ground down by the relentless Union advance. The Gray Fox himself recognized that each defensive victory, no matter how lopsided, brought his army closer to ultimate defeat. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. Grant could replace his losses, while Lee's reserves were nearly exhausted. The political ramifications of Cold Harbor extended far beyond the battlefield. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln faced mounting pressure from those who questioned the wisdom of Grant's aggressive strategy. The newspapers, particularly those opposed to the war, seized upon the casualty figures as evidence of the administration's callous disregard for human life. The upcoming presidential election loomed large, and the butcher's bill from Virginia threatened to cost Lincoln his political life. As referenced in Gordon Ria's detailed analysis of the campaign, The battle represented a turning point in civil war tactics, demonstrating the deadly effectiveness of entrenched defensive positions against traditional frontal assaults. The first day of the siege established patterns that would persist for the following 9 days. Sharpshooters from both sides engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse, picking off any soldier careless enough to expose himself above the parapets. Artillery duels erupted sporadically, though the Confederate guns were increasingly conserving ammunition. The wounded lying between the lines continued their agonizing vigil, their voices growing weaker as dehydration and infection took their toll. The second day of June 4th dawned, with the oppressive heat that would characterize the remainder of the siege. Between the opposing lines, the moans of the wounded had grown fainter, but they had not ceased entirely. Grant, his granite features etched with the strain of command, found himself confronting not just military defeat, but a humanitarian crisis that threatened to define his legacy. The Union trenches had grown more elaborate overnight, as thousands of soldiers wielded picks and shovels in a desperate attempt to create some protection from Confederate sharpshooters. The art of siege warfare, largely foreign to American armies at the war's outset, had been learned through bitter experience. Had logs timber placed along the top of breastworks, with gaps beneath for rifle barrels, began appearing along the Union lines, evidence of the soldiers' growing sophistication in trench construction. Colonel Horace Porter, one of Grant's staff officers, recorded in his diary that the commanding general had spent much of the night pacing in his tent, the weight of the day's casualties clearly troubling him. Porter noted that this was the first time he had seen Grant visibly shaken by the results of his tactical decisions. The general, who had gained fame for his willingness to accept heavy losses in pursuit of strategic objectives, was discovering that even his iron constitution had limits. The Confederate positions, by contrast, hummed with quiet efficiency. Lee's veterans had turned their earthworks into underground cities, complete with bomb-proofs, covered communications trenches, and elaborate drainage systems. These were no longer the hasty field fortifications of earlier campaigns, but sophisticated defensive works that would have impressed European military engineers. General Jubal Anderson Early, commanding the Confederate left flank, had positioned his artillery with devastating effectiveness. His guns, protected by earth and timber revetments, could deliver enfilading fire against any Union force that attempted to advance. The Confederate commander had learned well from the lessons of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, where defensive positions had proven their worth against superior numbers. But it was the human cost that truly defined the siege's second day. The wounded men lying between the lines had become pawns in a grim game of military protocol. Neither side was willing to request a formal truce to recover their casualties, as such a request would be seen as an admission of defeat. The result was a humanitarian disaster that shocked even veterans hardened by 3 years of warfare. Private Wilbur Fisk of the 2nd Vermont Regiment wrote to his hometown newspaper describing the scene. The groans and cries of the wounded men lying out there in the sun are enough to break the heart of anyone with the least spark of humanity. Yet military necessity demanded that these men be left to die, victims of a pride that placed honor above mercy. The tactical situation had evolved into something resembling the siege warfare of earlier centuries. Union engineers, working under cover of darkness, began constructing approach trenches, zigzag excavations that would allow attacking forces to move closer to Confederate positions without exposing themselves to fire. These saps, as they were called, represented the Army's adaptation to the new reality of warfare. Confederate counter-engineers responded with their own innovations. Mining operations began on both sides, with tunnels being dug beneath opposing positions. The subterranean war that would later characterize the siege of Petersburg had its origins in the trenches of Cold Harbor. Soldiers who had once fought in open fields now found themselves engaged in a deadly game of underground warfare. The psychological toll of the siege was becoming apparent throughout both armies. Union soldiers, many of whom had written their names and addresses on pieces of paper pinned to their uniforms before the June 3rd assault, lived with the constant awareness that death might come at any moment. The Confederate defenders, while tactically successful, were slowly being worn down by the constant vigilance required to maintain their positions. General Lee, his health already failing under the strain of command, recognized that time was not on his side. While his army had inflicted a devastating defeat on Grant's forces, the Union commander still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. More importantly, Grant's supply lines remained intact, while Lee's own logistics were becoming increasingly precarious. The political dimension of the siege was never far from the minds of either commander. In Richmond, Confederate President Jefferson Davis followed the battle's progress with keen interest, understanding that another tactical victory might not translate into strategic advantage. The Confederacy's ability to replace its losses was nearly exhausted, while Grant's army continued to receive reinforcements from the North. As referenced in the detailed historical analysis by the National Park Service, the siege represented a fundamental shift in Civil War tactics, with both sides adapting to the new realities of rifle-musket warfare and field fortification. The evening of June 4th brought little relief to either side. The temperature remained oppressive, and the stench of death was beginning to permeate the battlefield. Medical personnel worked frantically to treat the wounded who could be reached, but the majority of casualties from the morning assault remained beyond help. The siege of Cold Harbor had become a test of endurance that would push both armies to their limits. June 5th brought with it the grim realization that the siege of Cold Harbor had evolved into something far more sinister than either army had anticipated. The morning revealed a battlefield transformed by 2 days of continuous labor, with both sides having constructed elaborate defensive networks that stretched as far as the eye could see. What had begun as a simple tactical engagement had become a preview of the industrial warfare that would define the 20th century. The Union forces, under the direct supervision of General Grant, had managed to establish a series of parallel trenches that snaked across the Virginia landscape like a vast serpent. These earthworks, constructed primarily during the dark hours to avoid Confederate sharpshooters, represented the collective labor of thousands of soldiers working with primitive tools. Bayonets served as picks, tin cups became shovels, and bare hands clawed at the Virginia clay in a desperate attempt to create some protection from the deadly fire. Major General Horatio Wright, commanding the 6th Corps, had proven particularly innovative in his defensive arrangements. His engineers had constructed a series of redoubts, small, enclosed fortifications that provided mutually supporting fields of fire. These positions, connected by communication trenches, allowed for the rapid movement of troops and supplies, while maintaining defensive integrity. The Confederate response had been equally impressive. General Lee, despite his failing health, had personally supervised the construction of what military historians would later describe as the most sophisticated field fortifications seen in the war. To that point, his soldiers, many of whom had spent the previous winter in camp, had used their idle time to study the principles of military engineering. The result was a defensive system that incorporated lessons learned from European siege warfare, dating back to the campaigns of Napoleon. The psychological warfare between the opposing forces had intensified dramatically. Confederate sharpshooters, many of them recruited from the mountains of Virginia and North Carolina, had established a reign of terror over the Union lines. These marksmen, armed with rifle muskets equipped with telescopic sights, could pick off any Union soldier careless enough to expose himself above the parapets. The effect on morale was devastating, as soldiers lived in constant fear of sudden death. Union counter-snipers had been deployed in response, leading to a deadly game of cat and mouse that played out across the battlefield. Decoy targets' hats, placed on sticks, were used to draw enemy fire and reveal sniper positions. Once located, these positions would be subjected to concentrated artillery fire. Though the Confederate marksmen had proven remarkably skilled at changing positions and avoiding detection, the most tragic aspect of the siege remained the plight of the wounded men lying between the lines. By June 5th, their cries had grown notably weaker, and many had fallen silent entirely. The summer heat, combined with lack of water and medical attention, had claimed many lives that might have been saved under different circumstances. Both armies were aware of the situation, but neither was willing to request the formal truce that would have allowed for their recovery. Private John Haley of the 17th Maine Regiment recorded in his diary that the sounds coming from no man's land were enough to drive a man mad. He described hearing wounded soldiers calling for their mothers, begging for water, and in some cases, pleading for someone to end their suffering. The psychological impact on the troops was severe, with many soldiers reporting nightmares and an inability to sleep. The logistical challenges facing both armies had become acute. Union supply lines, while still functioning, were under constant threat from Confederate cavalry raids. General Wade Hampton's horsemen had proven particularly effective at disrupting Union communications and supply convoys. The result was periodic shortages of ammunition, medical supplies, and food that added to the general misery of the siege. Confederate logistics were in far worse condition. Lee's army, always operating on thin margins, was beginning to feel the effects of the Union blockade and the loss of productive territory. Ammunition was being carefully rationed, and soldiers were often reduced to firing only when they had clear targets. Food supplies were irregular, and many Confederate units were subsisting on reduced rations. The artillery exchanges that characterized the siege had evolved into a complex science of trajectory and counter-battery fire. Union artillery, with its superior resources and ammunition supplies, maintained a steady bombardment of Confederate positions. However, the effectiveness of this fire was limited by the sophisticated earthworks that protected the Confederate guns. Confederate artillery, while less numerous, was employed with deadly precision against Union positions. As referenced in the comprehensive military analysis published by the Essential Civil War Curriculum, the siege demonstrated the evolution of artillery tactics in response to improved defensive positions. The medical situation in both armies had reached crisis proportions. Field hospitals, established in whatever shelter could be found, were overwhelmed with casualties from the ongoing sniper war and periodic artillery bombardments. Surgeons worked round the clock, often by candlelight, to treat wounds that ranged from minor flesh wounds to devastating injuries that required immediate amputation. The psychological toll of the siege was perhaps most evident in the letters that soldiers wrote home. Union correspondence, intercepted by Confederate forces, revealed a growing sense of desperation and war weariness. Many soldiers expressed doubt about the wisdom of the campaign and questioned whether the strategic objectives were worth the human cost. Confederate letters, while generally more optimistic about the tactical situation, revealed growing concerns about the Army's ability to sustain the siege indefinitely. The dawn of June 6th revealed a battlefield that had been transformed by the accumulated misery of 3 days of siege warfare. The Virginia countryside, once pastoral and serene, now resembled a moonscape of earthworks, shell craters, and the detritus of war. The stench of death had become so pervasive that soldiers on both sides tied cloth around their faces in a futile attempt to filter the air they breathed. General Grant, his uniform now stained with the mud and sweat of days spent in the trenches, faced the most difficult decision of his military career. The tactical situation had become untenable. His forces were pinned down by Confederate fire. His casualty lists continued to grow, and the strategic objectives that had justified the assault seemed increasingly distant. Yet retreat would be seen as admission of defeat, potentially fatal to Northern morale and Lincoln's prospects for re-election. The Union commanders' daily staff meetings had taken on an increasingly somber tone. Colonel Eli Parker, Grant's military secretary and a Seneca Indian who had trained as an engineer, provided detailed reports on the construction of approach trenches and the progress of mining operations. The news was consistently discouraging. Confederate positions remained impregnable, and every attempt to advance resulted in additional casualties. Meanwhile, in the Confederate camps, General Lee was grappling with his own strategic dilemmas. While his army had achieved a remarkable tactical victory, the broader picture remained troubling. Intelligence reports indicated that Union reinforcements were arriving daily, while his own forces were being slowly worn down by the constant vigilance required to maintain their positions. More critically, ammunition supplies were running dangerously low, and resupply efforts were being hampered by Union cavalry operations. The human dimension of the siege had reached truly horrific proportions. The wounded men lying between the lines had been exposed to the elements for days, and their suffering had become a source of anguish for soldiers on both sides. Some Union soldiers had attempted unauthorized rescue missions under cover of darkness, but these efforts had been met with deadly fire from Confederate pickets, who could not distinguish between rescue parties and attacking forces. Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Lyman, serving on General George Meade's staff, wrote extensively about the psychological impact of the siege on Union forces. His observations, later published in his memoirs, described an army that was slowly losing its fighting spirit. Soldiers who had once advanced eagerly into battle now moved with the resignation of men who expected to die. The esprit de corps that had sustained the Army of the Potomac through previous campaigns was being eroded by the futility of their situation. The Confederate perspective was more complex. While Lee's veterans took pride in their defensive success, they were also aware that their strategic position was becoming increasingly precarious. Desertions, while not yet epidemic, were beginning to increase as soldiers recognized that the war was entering a new and more terrible phase. The romantic notions of warfare that had sustained both armies in the conflict's early years had been replaced by a grim determination to survive. The technological innovation that characterized the siege had continued to evolve. Union engineers, working under the supervision of skilled professionals borrowed from civilian life, had begun constructing more sophisticated approach trenches. These excavations, designed according to principles learned from European siege warfare, allowed for the gradual advance of attacking forces while providing protection from defensive fire. Confederate counter-engineering efforts had proven equally innovative. Southern soldiers, many of whom had worked in mining operations before the war, had begun their own tunneling operations designed to disrupt Union siege works. These subterranean battles, fought in claustrophobic conditions beneath the Virginia earth, represented a new dimension of warfare that would later be refined during the siege of Petersburg. The artillery exchanges that punctuated each day had become more scientific in their approach. Union battery commanders, with access to superior maps and surveying equipment, had begun employing indirect fire techniques that allowed them to strike Confederate positions without exposing their own guns. Confederate artillery, while less numerous, was employed with deadly precision against Union positions that showed any sign of activity. The medical crisis affecting both armies had reached desperate proportions. Union field hospitals, established in whatever structures could be commandeered, were overwhelmed with casualties from the ongoing sniper war and periodic artillery bombardments. Surgeons worked in conditions that would have been considered primitive in civilian hospitals, often operating without adequate anesthesia or antiseptic materials. Confederate medical facilities faced even greater challenges. Southern armies had always struggled with medical supplies, and the Union blockade had made these shortages critical. Confederate surgeons often had to make do with improvised instruments and medications, leading to higher mortality rates among the wounded. As referenced in the detailed analysis provided by the History Channel's comprehensive coverage of Civil War battles, the siege represented a fundamental shift in military medicine, with both sides being forced to adapt to the challenges of treating large numbers of casualties in static positions. The political implications of the siege were becoming increasingly apparent to commanders on both sides. In Washington, President Lincoln faced mounting pressure from those who questioned the wisdom of Grant's aggressive strategy. The newspapers, particularly those opposed to the war, seized upon the casualty figures as evidence of the administration's callous disregard for human life. The Confederate government in Richmond was also feeling the pressure of the siege. While Lee's tactical success was welcomed, political leaders understood that the Confederacy's ability to sustain such defensive operations was limited. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. Grant could replace his losses, while Lee's reserves were nearly exhausted. By June 7th, the siege of Cold Harbor had evolved into something that transcended mere military engagement. It had become a test of human endurance that pushed both armies to the very limits of their physical and psychological capabilities. The battlefield, now scarred by miles of earthworks, and the Confederate response to the Union withdrawal revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Lee's position. The Gray Fox, despite his tactical success at Cold Harbor, had been unable to prevent Grant's disengagement. His army, while victorious in defensive combat, lacked the mobility and strength to pursue and destroy the retreating Union forces. The strategic initiative, despite the tactical defeat, remained with Grant. The human cost of the Cold Harbor siege was staggering by any measure. Union casualties for the entire operation exceeded 12,000 men, with the majority of these losses occurring during the disastrous assault of June 3rd. Confederate casualties were significantly lower, perhaps 3,000 total, but Lee's army could ill afford even these limited losses. Given the Confederacy's dwindling manpower resources, the psychological impact of Cold Harbor extended far beyond the immediate participants. News of the disaster spread quickly through the northern states, carried by newspapers that seized upon the casualty figures as evidence of Grant's callous disregard for human life. The upcoming presidential election loomed large, and the butcher's bill from Virginia threatened to cost Lincoln his political future. In the Confederate States, the victory at Cold Harbor provided a temporary boost to morale that had been sagging under the weight of 3 years of warfare. However, perceptive Southern leaders understood that tactical victories, no matter how lopsided, could not compensate for the Confederacy's fundamental strategic disadvantages. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. Grant could replace his losses, while Lee's reserves were nearly exhausted. The final tragedy of Cold Harbor was played out in the no-man's land between the opposing armies. The wounded men who had fallen during the June 3rd assault had been lying there for over a week, and their suffering had become a source of anguish that transcended military rivalry. Only after the Union withdrawal were Confederate forces able to venture into the killing ground and provide aid to the few survivors who had somehow endured their ordeal. The technological lessons of Cold Harbor would resonate throughout the remainder of the Civil War and beyond. The siege had demonstrated the deadly effectiveness of entrenched defensive positions against traditional frontal assaults, foreshadowing the industrial warfare that would characterize the 20th century. The elaborate earthworks constructed by both armies represented a new sophistication in field fortification that would later be refined. During the siege of Petersburg, the strategic consequences of Cold Harbor were complex and far-reaching. While Lee had achieved a remarkable tactical victory,